The men who rode out that morning believed they were participating in a tradition older than the land deeds they carried in their coat pockets. They called it a hunt, though no animal ever wore irons or bled from whipped skin. It was a sport disguised as order, a ritual meant to remind the countryside who owned breath and movement in silence. 7 white overseers and hired trackers gathered just after dawn, their horses stamping impatiently in the cool mist as the forest steamed awake around them. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from, and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. They laughed easily, too easily. One of them, a thick-necked man with a red beard and a crooked nose broken long ago in a tavern fight, lifted his rifle and pretended to sight down the barrel at an invisible target. Another uncorked a flask and passed it around. The air smelled of damp earth, horse sweat, and cheap whiskey. The sun had not yet burned through the fog, and Spanish moss hung from the trees like tattered curtains, swaying gently in a breeze that barely reached the forest floor. They spoke his name the way men speak of vermin. 7 inches, one of them said, snorting with laughter. Ain't that what they called him? That's what the driver said, another replied. Tall as a fence post, thinks that makes him special. They all laughed again, the sound echoing unnaturally between the trunks. To them the nickname was a joke, a crude measurement meant to strip the man of dignity and reduce him to something discussable over drinks. None of them used his real name. Most of them had never known it. What they knew was that he had run. 2 nights earlier he had slipped away from the plantation just before a storm rolled in from the west. The rain had come down hard and sudden, flattening tracks, drowning scent, confusing dogs. By the time the absence was noticed, hours had passed. By the time a rider was sent after him, the forest had swallowed whatever direction he'd taken. That was when the decision was made not to call for dogs immediately. Dogs were practical. Dogs were efficient. This, however, was meant to be enjoyable. They mounted up and rode into the trees in a loose line, rifles slung casually, talking over one another as if on a Sunday ride. Hooves squelched into soft ground. Branches snapped under careless hands. They made no attempt at silence. Why would they? A runaway was assumed to be frightened, exhausted, half-starved. Someone who would bolt at the first shout. They expected fear. They did not expect patience. Miles ahead of them, the man they hunted had already stopped running. He had learned long ago that flight without direction only fed pursuit. He had learned it the hard way, in a different forest, under a different flag. Back then, the men chasing him had worn gray and fired in volleys, their shots wild and loud. Back then, he had worn blue, though no one would ever bother to write his name next to the uniform in any ledger that mattered. He moved through the trees now with the same controlled awareness he had learned in that war. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. He knew the ground, not because he owned it, but because he had worked it, bled on it, slept on it under the open sky when sleep was permitted. When the sound of horses finally reached him, distant but unmistakable, he did not panic. He knelt, pressed a hand to the soil, and felt the faint vibration of hooves through the earth. He closed his eyes briefly, listening, counting, mapping their movement in his mind. 7 riders. Too many for chance. Too few for an army. A hunting party. He moved deeper into the forest, not away from them, but across their path, angling toward a stand of cypress and oak, where the ground rose slightly and the undergrowth thinned. A place where visibility stretched farther than most men realized. A place where sound carried strangely, distorted by trunks and hanging moss. When he reached it, he stopped. He removed the iron shackle still clamped around his ankle, its edges rusted, its weight familiar. It had slowed him for miles, bruised bone and skin, but he had refused to discard it until now. He dug into the soft earth with his hands, burying the shackle beneath leaves and mud, covering it carefully, as if marking a grave. Then he straightened and shrugged off the rough sack he carried across his back. Inside was the rifle. It was long and well cared for, its wood darkened with oil and use. Not a plantation piece, not a hunting toy. This was a soldier's weapon, balanced and precise, its barrel capable of reaching farther than any of the men riding toward him would suspect. He ran a hand along it almost unconsciously, checking the stock, the sight, the smoothness of motion. Familiar, reliable. He had carried rifles like this before, under orders shouted by men who never looked him in the eye. He had fired from tree lines and ridges, from prone positions soaked with rain and blood. He had learned how to wait. That was the difference they did not understand. The overseers believed the hunt had begun when they entered the forest. In truth, it had begun the moment he stopped running. They came on loud and careless, voices drifting ahead of them through the trees. The man lay low and watched them approach, unseen, his body pressed into shadow. He counted their breaths, their gestures, the way one man rode slightly ahead, the way another lagged behind, fiddling with his reins. He saw arrogance in the way they sat their horses. Confidence born not of skill but of habit. men who had never needed to measure distance because distance had never mattered to them before. One of them fired a shot into the air, laughing as birds burst from the canopy. "Come on out, boy," he shouted. "We ain't gonna hurt you too bad." The man in the trees did not flinch. He watched the way the fog moved, how it thinned in places and thickened in others. He watched the moss sway and settle. He felt the breeze brush his cheek and calculated how it would carry a bullet. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to remember another dawn years ago, when he had lain in a field watching enemy lines form in the distance. The smell had been different then, powder and churned grass instead of wet leaves and rot, but the feeling was the same, that tightening in the chest, that narrowing of the world until there was only breath, sight, and the steady presence of the rifle. He exhaled slowly. The overseers rode closer, still unaware. They spoke of what they would do when they caught him, of chains and lashes and lessons. Their words drifted through the trees, ugly and careless. The man adjusted his position by inches, settling the rifle into the hollow of his shoulder. He aligned the sight with the rider at the front, the one laughing the loudest, the one whose head bobbed carelessly as his horse stepped over roots. He did not hate him. Hate wasted energy. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the forest like the tearing of cloth, sharp and sudden. For an instant, everything froze. Then the man at the front pitched backward off his horse, his body snapping with the force of the impact, his hat flying free as he hit the ground. The sound reached them a heartbeat later. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted, swore, dragged at reins. Rifles were yanked up, pointed in every direction at once. One man fired blindly into the trees, the shot splintering bark yards away from where the sniper had already moved. Because he had moved. The moment the rifle fired, the man was already shifting, rolling, melting deeper into cover. He did not linger to watch the result. He did not need to. He had learned never to admire his own work. He reloaded with practiced speed, hands steady, breath controlled. He slid into a new position 20 yards away, lower this time, partially obscured by roots and shadow. The overseers were shouting now, fear sharp in their voices. What the hell was that? Where did it come from? Get him! Get him! They fired again, shots cracking wildly, bullets tearing leaves and dirt but finding nothing living. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with fog, blurring their vision further. The man watched them through it all, calm and still. They were no longer laughing. The hunt, as they understood it, had ended. What remained was something older, something the forest remembered well. A man alone, patient and skilled, facing men who had mistaken cruelty for strength. He drew a bead on another rider, adjusting slightly as the horse sidestepped. The man was shouting orders now, his voice shrill with fear. The sniper squeezed the trigger again, and the forest answered. The sound of the second shot did not echo the way the first had. It seemed to sink into the forest, swallowed by bark and fog and hanging moss, as if the land itself understood what was happening and chose silence over announcement. The overseer who had been shouting orders jerked sideways in the saddle, his words cut clean in half. For a split second his body remained upright, hands still clutching the reins, confusion frozen across his face. Then his shoulder exploded outward, bone and cloth tearing as the force of the bullet spun him down into the mud. His horse bolted, screaming, dragging the wounded man several feet before he slipped free and collapsed in a tangle of limbs and wet leaves. That was when true panic took hold. The remaining overseers shouted over one another, voices cracking, commands overlapping and dissolving into noise. Rifles were raised again, but this time hands shook badly enough that barrels wavered, sights useless. They fired anyway. Shots thundered through the trees, splintering trunks, shredding branches, punching holes in fog that closed again immediately. None of the bullets came close. The man with the rifle had already moved. He slid through the undergrowth, with a smoothness that came only from repetition, knees and elbows finding earth without sound. He stayed low, using the chaos he had created as cover. Smoke from their gunfire drifted unevenly, and he used it, shifting positions while their eyes burned and watered. He knew better than to fire twice from the same place. That lesson had been learned years ago, paid for by the blood of men who had not moved quickly enough. In those days, officers had barked orders about spacing and angles, about patience and discipline. Those officers were gone now, their names remembered, their ranks recorded. He remained unnamed, but the knowledge stayed with him. The overseers tried to regroup. "Spread out," one of them shouted, his voice thin with fear. "He's just one man." They did not realize how wrong that sounded. Two dismounted, tying their horses hastily to nearby trees, fingers fumbling with knots. One knelt behind a fallen log, peering into the haze. Another crouched low, pressing his back against a cypress, trying to make himself small for the first time in his life. The wounded man in the mud was screaming. It was a raw animal sound, high and desperate, echoing through the forest and raising gooseflesh on exposed skin. Blood soaked into the ground beneath him, darkening the leaves, steaming faintly in the cool air. One of the overseers glanced toward him, torn between instinct and terror. That hesitation cost him. The third shot came from farther away than the first two, From an angle none of them were watching. It took the man clean through the chest. He staggered, mouth opening as if to speak, then folded forward without a sound, face first into the dirt. For a moment no one moved. The forest seemed unnaturally still, as if even the insects had fallen silent. Smoke drifted lazily between the trees. Somewhere a horse snorted and stamped. 3 men down, the others finally understood. "This ain't no runaway," one of them whispered, his voice barely audible. Another shook his head violently, as if denying the thought might make it untrue. "Impossible," he said. "He couldn't." A shot snapped past him, close enough that he felt the air move. He flinched hard, dropping flat behind the log, heart hammering. The man with the rifle watched them scatter, watched fear take shape in their movements. He felt no rush, no thrill, only focus. The world narrowed again, as it always did, until there was nothing but position, distance, and timing. He crawled to higher ground, easing himself into a shallow depression between roots. From there he could see the clearing clearly, the men darting like spooked animals, their confidence gone, replaced by frantic, disorganized motion. He could hear their breathing now, ragged and uneven, hear the way their boots scraped and slipped in mud. He adjusted his rifle and waited. Minutes stretched. The overseers tried to move again, this time more cautiously, advancing in short bursts, stopping to peer into the trees. One of them attempted to take charge, shouting orders that contradicted one another almost immediately. They were trying to impose structure where none existed, clinging to the idea that authority alone could save them. The sniper shifted slightly, angling his body to reduce his profile. He lined up another shot, then paused. He had learned patience from older men who spoke rarely and watched everything. Men who had taught him that survival was not about speed, but about knowing when to act. He let the overseers sweat, let their fear ferment, let their mistakes multiply. One of them broke. He rose suddenly and ran, crashing through brush, branches whipping at his face. He did not choose a direction so much as flee blindly, driven by the animal certainty that stillness meant death. The man with the rifle tracked him calmly. He led the target slightly, accounting for the uneven ground, the way panic made men run crooked. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet took the runner through the back of the thigh, shattering bone and dropping him instantly. The man screamed and rolled, clutching at the ruin of his leg, mud smearing his face. The scream cut off abruptly when another shot followed, clean and final. Silence fell again, heavier this time, 4 dead. The remaining overseers pressed themselves into cover, faces pale beneath dirt and sweat. One of them vomited quietly, hands shaking so badly he could barely wipe his mouth. Another whispered prayers under his breath, words tumbling over one another. "He's toying with us," someone said, his voice cracking. The sniper heard it and allowed himself a single cold thought. "No, I am finishing this." He moved again, circling wide, staying downwind, using every trick the forest offered. His boots made no sound on the damp ground. He avoided snapping branches, stepping where leaves were thickest. He could feel the forest working with him, swallowing his presence, blurring his outline. From his new position, he could see the last 3 men clearly. They were huddled closer now, backs nearly touching, rifles clutched tight, eyes darting wildly. One had lost his hat. Another's hands were slick with blood that was not his own. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, stripped of the swagger they had ridden in with. They spoke in whispers now. "We should go back," one said. "This ain't right." "We can't," another replied. "He'll pick us off." A third shook his head slowly, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "He's a soldier," he whispered, as if saying it aloud might summon help that would never come. "God help us, he's a soldier." The man with the rifle felt something then, not pity, not satisfaction, but recognition. He remembered similar fear on other faces long ago. He remembered gray coats and blue, remembered the way men all looked the same when death drew close. He adjusted his grip. The next shot took one of the 3 through the side, punching through ribs and lungs. The man collapsed with a wet gasp, blood bubbling at his lips. The others screamed, firing wildly, bullets flying high and wide. The sniper was already moving. He did not fire again immediately. He let them feel the gap between shots, the waiting, the uncertainty. He let them imagine where he might be, how close. One of them bolted again, running deeper into the trees, sobbing openly now, boots splashing through shallow water. The sniper did not follow. He did not need to. The last man left standing froze, paralyzed, rifle slipping from numb fingers. He dropped to his knees, hands raised, eyes wild. "I surrender," he shouted into the trees. "You hear me? I surrender." The forest did not answer. The man with the rifle watched him for a long moment. He could see the tremor in the man's shoulders, the way his chest heaved. He could hear his breath even from this distance. He did not fire. Instead, he shifted away, melting back into the trees, leaving the man alone with his fear and the bodies of his companions. He had learned long ago that sometimes terror was more effective than death. He would deal with the last men later. For now, he needed distance. He moved deeper into the forest, putting space between himself and the clearing, circling toward the swamp where sound died quickly and tracks dissolved into water. He paused briefly to reload, hands steady despite the exertion. His breathing slowed again, settling into a familiar rhythm. Behind him, the overseer's voices faded, swallowed by trees and fog. By the time the sun climbed higher and burned away some of the mist, the forest bore quiet witness to what had occurred. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Blood darkened the earth. Rifles rested abandoned, useless without the men who had wielded them. And somewhere beyond sight, the man they had hunted moved with purpose and control, already planning the next phase. The hunt was over. The war, however, had only just begun. Night did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the forest slowly, pooling beneath trees, thickening the shadows until the spaces between trunks became corridors of darkness. The fog that had lingered since morning began to cool and settle, hugging the ground, turning distance into illusion. Sounds carried strangely now, too far in some directions, swallowed completely in others. Every snap of wood, every rustle of leaves felt magnified, distorted. The remaining overseers felt it immediately. They were no longer moving with any plan. Whatever authority or structure had existed among them earlier had dissolved along with daylight. The clearing where the bodies lay was avoided instinctively, as if death itself might rise from the blood-soaked ground. They retreated deeper into the forest, not together so much as near one another, driven by the shared terror of being alone. No one spoke above a whisper. They stopped near a cluster of trees where the ground rose slightly and the roots twisted like exposed bones. One man leaned against a trunk, gasping, his chest hitching uncontrollably. Another sank down onto a fallen log, head in his hands, rocking back and forth as if movement alone could keep him alive. "How many left?" someone whispered. No one answered. Counting felt dangerous. Naming the number made it real. Somewhere out there beyond reach of their eyes, the man with the rifle was moving. They could feel him without seeing him, a pressure in the air, an awareness that refused to fade. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. They tried to make a fire. The first match snapped uselessly in trembling fingers. The second flared briefly, illuminating wide, terrified eyes before going out. When a flame finally caught, it was small and weak, more glow than light. It did nothing to push back the darkness beyond the immediate circle. Instead, it made the shadows thicker, sharper, turning every tree into a looming shape. The man with the rifle watched the fire bloom from a distance. He had expected it. Fear drove men to light, to warmth, to anything that felt like control. He circled them slowly, never stepping into the fire's reach, keeping the glow at the edge of his vision. From where he crouched, he could see their faces clearly when they leaned forward, hands shaking as they fed twigs into the flame. They looked older now. Smaller. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and waited. Time stretched. The men whispered among themselves, voices barely audible. "We should have brought dogs," one muttered. "We should have never come," another replied. A third said nothing, staring into the fire with glassy eyes, lips moving soundlessly. Prayer, perhaps, or bargaining. The forest answered them with insects and distant calls, sounds that seemed too loud in the stillness. Every now and then something moved in the underbrush, a raccoon, a deer, something harmless. But each noise sent hands flying to rifles, hearts pounding. The sniper let them feel it. He shifted position deliberately once, allowing a branch to snap beneath his boot. The sound was small, insignificant. It froze them completely. All three men jerked toward the noise, rifles raised, fingers tightening on triggers. One fired instantly, the shot cracking through the trees, muzzle flash briefly illuminating his panicked expression. The bullet went nowhere useful, tearing into darkness. Silence followed, heavier than before. The man with the rifle did not fire back. He wanted them to wonder. Minutes passed, then more. Sweat trickled down spines despite the cooling air, muscles cramped from holding still too long. Fear settled into their bones, deep and aching. Another sound came, this one unmistakable, metal, the soft, deliberate click of a rifle being reloaded. It came from their left, or their right, or somewhere behind them. The forest twisted sound until direction became meaningless. One of the overseers let out a sob before he could stop himself. "He's close," he whispered. "Closer than you think," the sniper thought. He had moved to within 50 yards now, using the firelight against them. Every time one leaned forward, their silhouette sharpened, clean and visible. He lay prone behind a fallen tree, body pressed flat, rifle resting steady. His breathing slowed until it matched the rhythm of the night. He selected his next target carefully. The man on the left kept glancing over his shoulder, unable to stop himself. His fear was raw, unfiltered. He was the weakest link. Panic would undo him soon, with or without a bullet. The sniper waited anyway. He remembered another night long ago, crouched in mud with rain soaking through his coat, waiting for an enemy officer to step into view. He remembered the weight of waiting, the way time seemed to bend around it. He remembered pulling the trigger then too, and the strange calm that followed. That calm returned now. The man glanced back again. The shot took him through, the temple. There was no scream this time, no drama. His body slumped sideways, collapsing against the log before sliding down into the dirt. The crack of the rifle echoed briefly, then vanished. The remaining 2 men erupted in chaos. One leapt to his feet, firing wildly into the trees, emptying his rifle in seconds. The other fell backward, scrambling, trying to reload with hands that refused to cooperate. The fire was kicked apart in the confusion, embers scattering, plunging them into deeper darkness. The sniper moved immediately. He did not stay to admire the kill. He rose, shifted position, disappeared again. By the time the overseer's bullets tore through the space he had occupied, he was already elsewhere. One of the men ran. He turned and bolted into the trees without a word, crashing through brush, branches snapping loudly. His breath came in wet gasps, panic driving him forward blindly. He did not see the root that caught his foot. He hit the ground hard, rolling, screaming in pain. The sniper tracked him calmly through the chaos. He did not fire yet. The second man remained behind, paralyzed, spinning in place, trying to decide which direction to face. His rifle clicked uselessly, empty. He fumbled for powder and ball, fingers numb, mind racing. He never finished reloading. The sniper fired once. The man jerked backward, collapsing against a tree before sliding down, leaving a dark smear on the bark. His rifle slipped from his grasp and fell into the leaves with a dull thud. Now only one remained. The forest seemed to close in on the last overseer, as he struggled to his knees, clutching his injured leg, sobbing openly now. The pain was intense, but fear was worse. He could hear movement all around him, soft, deliberate steps that might have been real or imagined. Every shadow seemed to breathe. "Please," he cried, his voice breaking. "Please, I ain't—" The words dissolved into sobs. The sniper approached slowly, deliberately allowing his presence to be felt. He did not step into view. He let the man hear him instead, the controlled sound of boots on leaves, the faint scrape of fabric against bark. The overseer dragged himself backward, eyes wild, hands raised. "I won't say nothing," he pleaded. "I swear it, I won't tell nobody, just let me go." The man with the rifle stopped moving. For a long moment there was nothing but the overseer's ragged breathing and the distant call of a night bird. The sniper considered him. He thought of the plantation, of chains, of the laughter that morning, of the word sport. He thought of the men already dead, of the ones who would never ride out laughing again. He lowered his rifle slightly. "Run," he said. The word was calm, flat, almost gentle. The overseer stared, not understanding. "Run," the sniper repeated. The man did not need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, pain forgotten, and fled into the darkness, limping badly but moving fast, disappearing into the trees with desperate speed. The sniper watched him go. He did not fire. Some lessons lasted longer when carried. When the forest finally settled, it did so reluctantly, as if unsure the danger had truly passed. The bodies lay where they had fallen, pale shapes barely visible in the gloom. The fire had died completely, leaving only smoke and the faint smell of burned wood. The sniper moved among the aftermath briefly, checking weapons, ensuring no one stirred. He took what he needed, powder, shot, a canteen, and left the rest. He erased obvious tracks where he could, then turned toward the deeper woods, toward the swamp where water would erase what land remembered. As he walked, the adrenaline drained away, leaving a familiar emptiness in its wake. Not regret, not satisfaction, something quieter, colder. By the time dawn came, rumors would already be forming. Whispers carried by frightened men and half-seen shapes. Stories would grow teeth, but for now, there was only the forest, damp and silent once more, holding the truth close among its roots. And somewhere within it, the man they had hunted moved on, unbroken, unseen, leaving fear behind him like footprints no one dared follow. Dawn came thin and colorless, a pale washing of light that crept through the trees rather than arriving with any confidence. The fog did not lift so much as loosen its grip, thinning into long, drifting veils that slid between trunks and over roots slick with dew. The forest looked bruised in this half-light, scarred by the night's violence. Broken branches, torn leaves, dark stains soaking into the soil where men had fallen. The man with the rifle watched the change carefully. He had not slept. He rarely did after nights like this. Instead, he had moved, slow and deliberate, circling wide arcs through the woods, checking his bearings, listening for any sound that did not belong to the forest waking up. Birds had begun to call hesitantly, as if testing whether it was safe to speak again. Somewhere in the distance, an animal splashed through shallow water, life tentative but persistent. He paused at the edge of a clearing he recognized from the night before. 2 men remained. They were there, exactly where fear had driven them to cluster together after the fire died. Both were standing now, stiff and exhausted, eyes sunken, clothes stained with sweat and blood that was not theirs. One leaned heavily on his rifle like a walking stick. The other kept turning his head sharply at every sound, unable to stop himself, nerves frayed beyond control. They had not slept either. The man with the rifle studied them from concealment, letting the morning light do some of the work for him. Dawn stripped away illusions. In the clearer air he could see every detail. The tremor in one man's hands, the way the other's jaw clenched and unclenched as if he were chewing on words he could not bring himself to say. These were not the men who had ridden out laughing the day before. These were survivors of something they did not understand. He thought briefly of letting the forest take them as it had the others. Hunger and fear could finish what bullets had begun. But something in him resisted that option. Not mercy, not anger, closure. He shifted his weight and stepped forward. The crunch of leaves beneath his boot was quiet, controlled, but it was enough. Both overseers spun toward the sound instantly, rifles coming up in shaky unison. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. They stared into the thinning fog, eyes straining, breaths held. Then he stepped fully into view. He did not rush. He did not raise the rifle. He simply walked forward until the morning light touched his face. His height unmistakable now, his presence undeniable. The rifle hung loosely in his hands, barrel angled toward the ground, but there was no mistaking what it represented. The overseers froze. For a moment neither spoke. Their faces went slack with disbelief first, then tightened with something deeper and colder. Recognition, not of the man himself, but of what he was. Not prey, never prey. One of them swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "It's you," he said hoarsely, as if the words had scraped his throat raw. The man with the rifle stopped several paces away. He stood straight, shoulders relaxed, posture disciplined in a way that came from habit rather than effort. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "Yes," he said calmly. The sound of his voice seemed to strike them harder than any shot had. It was not wild. It was not pleading. It carried no trace of fear. It was steady, controlled, and unmistakably human. The other overseer let out a shaky breath. You're that one they talked about," he said half to himself. "From the war." The man did not answer immediately. He watched them closely, measuring reactions, cataloging every twitch and glance the way he always did. He saw the flicker of hope in their eyes at the fact that he had not fired. He saw how quickly that hope curdled into dread. "What did they say?" he asked at last. The question unsettled them. The first man licked his lips. "They said there was a black marksman," he murmured. "One who could—" He stopped himself, as if afraid to finish the thought. "Who could kill from farther than seemed possible," the sniper finished for him. "Who never missed." The overseer nodded weakly. "They said the Union used him when they needed a position cleared," the other added, voice barely above a whisper. "Said he'd take officers first, said he moved like smoke." The man with the rifle felt something stir then, not pride, not satisfaction, but a distant acknowledgement. Stories had a way of growing beyond the truth. He had never been alone out there, never been the only one. But legends simplified things. Legends made fear easier to swallow. "I was a soldier," he said simply. The word hung in the air. The overseers exchanged a glance, silent communication flashing between them. In that look was the unspoken understanding that this was no longer a matter of capture or punishment. There would be no riding back to the plantation with chains in triumph, whatever power they thought they carried. It evaporated the moment he stepped into the open. One of them dropped his rifle. It hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have. "We didn't know," the man said quickly, desperation spilling into his voice. "We swear it. If we'd known—" "You knew enough," the sniper replied. The other overseer fell to his knees suddenly, as if his legs had given out beneath him. "Please," he begged, hands raised. "Please, we were just following orders." The phrase landed heavily. The man with the rifle felt it settle somewhere deep in his chest, stirring old memories he kept carefully buried. He had heard those words shouted across battlefields, whispered in camps, written into reports that excused everything and explained nothing. He looked at the kneeling man for a long moment. "Stand up," he said. The overseer hesitated, then slowly rose, legs trembling so badly he nearly fell again. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air. The sniper took another step forward. Both men flinched instinctively, hands lifting higher, palms out. Their eyes flicked constantly to the rifle, to his face, back to the rifle again. "I will not hunt you," he said calmly. "I will not chase you." Hope flared in their expressions, sudden and desperate. "But this ends now," he continued. "Here." The first shot came without warning. It was fast, clean, professional. The bullet struck the standing overseer high in the chest, punching through muscle and bone. He staggered backward, mouth opening in shock, then collapsed heavily onto his back, eyes staring at the sky that had just begun to brighten. The second overseer screamed. The sound was shrill, animal, stripped of any remaining dignity. He spun, trying to run, but terror tangled his movements. He made it only a few steps before the second shot rang out. This one took him through the spine. He dropped instantly, body folding awkwardly, face hitting the ground with a sound that was almost gentle. The scream cut off mid-breath. Silence followed. Not the tense waiting silence of the night before, but something heavier. Final. The man with the rifle remained where he was, weapon lowered once more. He did not approach the bodies immediately. He had learned to wait, to be certain. After several long moments he stepped closer, checking for movement, for breath. There was none. He stood there for a while, looking down at them. In the clearer light of morning, they looked smaller than they had the day before. Just men, just bodies. He felt no triumph, only a settling. He moved methodically, checking their pockets, taking what he needed. Powder, shot, a clean cloth, a knife. He wiped his rifle carefully, a habitual motion, removing fingerprints, smudges, moisture. The care he showed the weapon was almost reverent, not out of affection, but respect for the tool that had kept him alive. When he finished, he stepped back and surveyed the clearing one last time. 7 had ridden in. None remained. The forest would keep the rest. He turned away from the bodies and began walking toward the east, toward the thicker woods and the winding paths that led to the swamp. Each step carried him farther from the plantation, farther from the names and numbers assigned to him by men who believed ownership could define a soul. As he walked, the sun finally broke through the trees, casting long beams of pale gold across the forest floor. Mist rose in slow curls, softening the edges of everything it touched. Behind him, the clearing lay quiet and empty, a place already slipping into rumor. Ahead of him, the land opened into uncertainty. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and kept moving, posture straight, pace steady, a soldier once more. Not for any flag, not for any cause written on paper, but for himself. The war had taught him how to kill. This land had taught him how to survive. And as the forest closed around him again, swallowing his form, one truth remained unshaken. Those who hunted him would never truly understand what they had faced. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They had mistaken history for something finished. They were wrong. The swamp announced itself long before it could be seen. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of rot and standing water. The ground softened underfoot, each step sinking slightly, releasing slow bubbles of dark moisture that smelled of decay and age. Trees thinned and then twisted, their trunks rising out of black water like broken pillars, roots exposed and tangled, clawing at the surface as if trying to escape the earth itself. Spanish moss hung lower here, drooping in long, pale strands that brushed against shoulders and faces, damp and cold to the touch. The last overseer ran blindly into it. He did not choose the swamp so much as flee into it, driven by terror rather than reason. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation burning his throat. His boots splashed loudly now, no longer careful, no longer controlled. Mud sucked greedily at his heels, threatening to steal his footing with every step. Pain radiated up his leg where the earlier wound throbbed viciously, but fear drowned it out, urging him forward no matter the cost. Behind him, the forest was silent. That silence terrified him more than gunfire ever could. He had expected a shot. He had expected the crack of the rifle, the sudden punch of impact, the end. But none came. No pursuit sounds followed him, no shouted command, no bullet tearing through brush, only the swamp. His imagination filled the void mercilessly. Every splash sounded like footsteps. Every ripple in the water looked like movement. He spun repeatedly, heart hammering, rifle clutched uselessly in his hands. The weapon felt heavier than it ever had, awkward, unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "Stay back," he screamed into the trees, his voice cracking. "I swear I'll shoot." The swamp answered with a low croak from somewhere unseen, followed by the sudden splash of something slipping into deeper water. The man whimpered and staggered forward again, several yards away, partially concealed by a cypress trunk. The man with the rifle watched him go. He had followed only far enough to be certain of direction. His steps were slow and measured, barely disturbing the surface of the water, where it lapped against roots and fallen branches. He knew this place, not intimately, but enough to understand its nature. Swamps did not need help to kill careless men. They were patient, thorough. He paused, listening. The overseer crashed through reeds ahead, making no attempt at silence now. Panic had stripped him of any remaining caution. The swamp closed around him eagerly, each step taking more effort than the last. His breath grew shallow. His heart felt like it might burst from his chest. The sniper did not raise his rifle. He lowered it instead, resting the barrel lightly against his shoulder as he stepped back, retreating into thicker cover. His role here was finished. What remained belonged to the land. The overseer pushed onward, desperate to find firmer ground, but the swamp offered none. Water rose to his ankles, then his calves, then his knees. Each step sent ripples across the surface, disturbing floating debris and releasing foul-smelling gas from below. His boots filled with water, becoming dead weight. He slipped. The fall was sudden and brutal. He went down hard, his rifle flying from his grasp and disappearing beneath the surface with a soft splash that seemed far too quiet. He clawed at the mud, fingers sinking deep, nails tearing as he tried to pull himself free. The water soaked his clothes instantly, chilling him to the bone. He screamed. The sound echoed weakly, swallowed almost immediately by fog and trees. Something brushed his leg. He kicked wildly, heart leaping into his throat, convinced it was teeth or coils or death rising up to claim him. But it was only submerged vegetation, long and slippery, wrapping around him like hands. Still he thrashed, sobbing openly now, breath hitching as panic spiraled out of control. He managed to get one knee under him, then another, pushing himself upright only to stumble again almost immediately. The swamp seemed to tilt, the ground shifting unpredictably beneath him. He staggered forward, tears streaming down his face, vision blurred. "I didn't mean it," he babbled to no one. "We was just doing what we was told." His voice sounded small and useless in the vast uncaring wetness around him. A step later the ground vanished. He plunged forward into deeper water, arms flailing, mouth filling with foul liquid. He surfaced briefly, coughing violently, spitting black water, eyes wide with terror. He tried to turn back, but the mud beneath him offered no purchase. Every movement sank him further, pulling him down inch by inch. Panic consumed him completely now. He clawed at floating roots, grasped at reeds that tore free in his hands. His screams became hoarse, raw, then dissolved into choking gasps as exhaustion set in. The water reached his chest, then his shoulders. Cold seeped into his muscles, sapping strength rapidly. He thrashed once more, then again, movements growing slower, weaker. The swamp did not rush him, it waited. From the edge of firmer ground the man with the rifle stood motionless, watching from a distance that kept him unseen. His face remained calm, unreadable. He did not intervene. He did not turn away either. He bore witness, as he had done so many times before in different places, under different skies. The overseer's head dipped beneath the surface once, then emerged again, eyes wild, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped. His arms flailed weakly, then stilled. The water closed over him. Ripples spread outward slowly, disturbing the floating leaves and moss. Then even those faded, the surface returning to its earlier stillness as if nothing had happened at all. The swamp swallowed the last trace of him without ceremony. The man with the rifle waited several minutes longer, listening, watching for any sign of movement. There was none. Only the steady chorus of insects and the distant call of birds reclaiming the morning. Satisfied, he turned away. He moved carefully now, retracing his steps just enough to reach drier ground before angling deeper into the wetlands, choosing paths that left no clear trail. Water erased footprints easily. Mud remembered nothing for long. As he walked, he felt the familiar hollowing inside him, the quiet that followed violence. It was not emptiness exactly, but a space where adrenaline drained away, leaving clarity behind. He checked his supplies again, adjusting the strap of his rifle, ensuring everything sat comfortably. The plantation lay somewhere behind him now, distant and irrelevant. Ahead, the swamp stretched endlessly, a maze of water and shadow and hidden paths known only to those who listened closely enough. He moved through it with care, reading signs invisible to others, the way birds shifted, the way insects went silent and returned, the subtle changes in water depth and current. By midday, the sun burned hotter overhead, turning fog into steam. The swamp smelled stronger, now ripe and alive. Sweat soaked his clothes, but he did not slow. He paused only once, at a small rise where water pooled shallowly, to drink sparingly from his canteen. As he rested, he thought briefly of the men who had come looking later. They would find nothing, no bodies in the swamp, no clear tracks, no answers. Rumors would form instead, passed in whispers along fence lines and taverns. Stories of a hunt gone wrong, of men who entered the woods and never returned, of a tall black man who moved like a ghost and killed like a soldier. Fear would do the rest. He rose and continued on. By evening he reached a stretch of higher ground where cypress gave way to hardwoods once more. He paused there, listening to the sounds of the swamp behind him, then turned east again, following a route he had memorized long ago. He did not know exactly where he would end up. He did not need to. What mattered was distance, separation, survival. Behind him the swamp settled into its ancient rhythm, water lapping softly against roots, insects humming, life continuing as it always had. Nothing marked the place where a man had vanished, no marker, no grave. Ahead of him the world remained dangerous and uncertain, but it was his to move through on his own terms. The overseers had hunted him for sport. They had run into the oldest ally he had ever known, and the swamp, like the war before it, had chosen its side. Weeks passed before anyone dared to speak openly about what had happened, and even then the words came out crooked, bent by fear and uncertainty. Stories rarely traveled straight in those parts of the South. They moved like smoke, drifting from mouth to mouth, changing shape as they went, growing heavier with each retelling. By the time the truth reached the edges of neighboring plantations, it was already something else entirely. 7 men had ridden out. None had returned. At first the absence was explained away with excuses meant to soothe nervous minds. Maybe they had gone farther than planned. Maybe they had stopped at another plantation, or taken shelter somewhere unexpected. Horses wandered back alone days later, reins torn, eyes wild, foam crusted around their mouths. That unsettled people more than bodies would have. Animals remembered terror in ways men could not explain away. A search party was formed eventually, though it was smaller than it should have been. No one volunteered eagerly. Men were chosen rather than asked, and even then, excuses were made, duties suddenly remembered, illnesses exaggerated. Those who did go carried more rifles than necessary and spoke very little as they entered the forest. They found signs at first: trampled ground, broken branches, empty cartridge casings half buried in mud. They found dark stains soaked deep into the soil where rain could not wash them away completely. They found a rifle snapped in two, abandoned near a fallen log, its wood warped and swollen with moisture. They did not find bodies. In the swamp they found nothing at all. The water lay smooth and dark, giving back no answers. Probing poles struck mud, roots, stones, but never flesh. The swamp had taken what it wanted and kept it. The search did not last long. Men claimed the land felt wrong, that sounds traveled where they should not, that shadows moved strangely at the edge of vision. Some swore they heard footsteps pacing them just beyond sight. Others said they felt watched constantly, as if the trees themselves were measuring them. No one laughed at those claims. Within days the search was abandoned. The forest was declared dangerous. The swamp was written off entirely. Officially the men were listed as missing. Unofficially everyone knew better. Plantations changed after that. Overseers rode in pairs where once they had ridden alone. Whips stayed coiled more often than not. Guns were kept closer at hand even during mundane tasks. At night lanterns burned longer, casting shaky light across yards and fields. Dogs were brought in and trained harder, though they refused to go near certain stretches of woods, no matter how badly their handlers beat or coaxed them. The enslaved people noticed the change immediately. They spoke of it quietly, in glances and half-finished sentences, in the careful language learned through years of survival. Something had shifted. The balance, fragile as it had always been, leaned just a little in a different direction. Now, fear had changed sides. Stories spread among them too, carried along work lines and whispered in quarters after dark. They spoke of a tall man who walked through bullets untouched, of a rifle that never missed, of overseers who laughed one morning and vanished by nightfall. The details varied, but the core remained the same. He had fought back. Some said he was still nearby, watching from the trees. Others believed he had moved on, heading north or west, following hidden routes passed down in fragments and rumor. A few claimed he was no longer entirely human, that the war had turned him into something else, something the land itself protected. The truth, as always, was simpler and more dangerous. The man with the rifle did not linger near the place where it had ended. He understood the rhythm of retaliation. He knew that men would come eventually, soldiers perhaps, or hired guns eager to make a name for themselves by killing a legend. Distance was safety. Movement was survival. He traveled by night when he could, resting during the day in places where the forest grew thick and the ground rose just enough to keep his feet dry. He followed paths that did not exist on any map, routes remembered through fragments of conversation and careful observation. He crossed streams where water erased his tracks and walked through long stretches of rocky ground that left little impression behind. Sometimes he encountered others like himself, runaways moving quietly, eyes wary, bodies tense with constant readiness. He did not reveal himself to them openly. A nod here, a subtle gesture there. Warnings given without explanation. He had learned that too much knowledge could be as dangerous as too little. At night, when he allowed himself rest, memories surfaced uninvited. The war returned to him in pieces rather than as a whole. The crack of rifles, the smell of powder. Orders shouted over chaos. Faces he could not name anymore, men who had stood beside him and then fallen without ceremony. He remembered how they had used him then, how his skill had been prized and hidden at the same time, how his kills had been counted but never credited. He wondered, sometimes, if any of the officers he had served under would recognize him now, if they would see a soldier or only what the world insisted he be. The question no longer mattered. In towns and crossroads far from the forest, rumors continued to grow. Slave catchers refused certain jobs outright, shaking their heads and muttering about cursed land. Some demanded double pay for hunts that led anywhere near swamps or deep woods. Others claimed illness or injury rather than admit fear. A few who ignored the warnings returned shaken, pale, speaking of sights they could not explain. Figures glimpsed at impossible distances, shots heard with no source. The sudden realization that they were being watched by someone they could not see. No one ever proved anything. That made it worse. Plantation owners petitioned local authorities for protection, framing their concerns in the language of property and order. Patrols were promised, meetings held. But resources were thin, and appetite for chasing ghosts was thinner still. Officials spoke of exaggeration and coincidence, of men lost to wilderness and misfortune. Privately they advised caution. The land remembered blood. People who lived close enough to it understood that. As seasons shifted, the story hardened into legend. Children heard it first as a warning. Don't stray too far, don't wander at night, don't anger what watches from the trees. Adults spoke of it in lower tones, the way people speak of storms and sickness, forces that could not be reasoned with or controlled. The legend did not need a name. It became enough to say, "He's out there." For the man himself, time moved differently. Days blended into one another as he traveled, each marked by small decisions that meant the difference between safety and death. He hunted when necessary, taking only what he needed. He kept his rifle clean, oiled, ready. He slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound, instinct honed to a fine edge by years of danger. Sometimes he thought of stopping, of finding a place to settle, a community that might accept him, a life not defined by movement and vigilance. But such places were rare, and trust was expensive. For now, motion remained his ally. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in dull reds and golds, he paused at the edge of a ridge overlooking miles of forest and wetland. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, campfires perhaps, or a settlement just beyond sight. The world stretched out before him, vast and uncertain. He felt no triumph standing there. What he felt instead was resolve. He had not set out to become a story. He had acted because there had been no other choice. The men who hunted him had believed violence was their right, their entertainment. They had believed the past protected them. They were wrong. History was not finished with them. With any of them. He turned away from the view and continued on, descending into the trees as darkness gathered once more. The forest accepted him without question, closing around his shape, racing his outline until he was just another shadow among many. Behind him, the legend continued to grow, fed by fear and silence and the absence of answers. Ahead of him lay a world that would never fully acknowledge what he had done or who he had been. That, too, he accepted. Recognition had never kept him alive before. What mattered was that the hunt had ended, not with chains or capture, but with understanding. Those who believed themselves hunters had learned, too late, that there were things in this land that could not be owned, mocked, or broken. And somewhere between the war that refused to end and the future that had not yet arrived, a man walked on. Unnamed, unrecorded, carrying with him the quiet certainty that fear, once planted, did not need tending. It grew on its own,